Hello, I'm Phil Svitek, and in this episode, I want to break down his Dark Materials, Season 2, Episode 5. And just kind of by that description, you can imagine it's going to be spoiler-filled. So in that sense, I assume you've seen the episode, you're ready to talk about it. If you haven't, well then, of course, go watch it, right? And then return, and let's chat. Now, if you're new to my recaps, I do it in kind of two parts. The first part focusing on the episode itself and the TV show, and then the second half tying in the book. So that way, if you haven't read the book, nothing will be spoiled for you in the first part. And by the time I get to the second part, I will call another spoiler. I will make it very clear that I'm about to get into the book side of things, okay? So that way, nothing is ruined for you if you haven't read the books. And so, yeah, without further ado, let's get into it, shall we? I really enjoyed this episode. I thought it was a good episode. Most notably, we didn't get the witches, and we didn't get Lee Scoresby and the shaman. And that's okay. I think, things are converging as they should. The primary focus was on Charles and Mrs. Coulter, then Mary, and then, of course, Will and Lyra. Now, we do get the Magisterium in some sense, but that's relatively quick, certainly not like when Mrs. Coulter was there, a couple, whatever, I don't know the timeline of days. We'll just say a couple days ago, right? But nonetheless, the Magisterium was there, but very kind of brief moment. But an important one. And I think let's start with that because, one of the things that this series is escalating is the idea of faith, good and evil, the nature of reality. God certainly plays into it, science, and like what ultimately is the truth, right? It's asking all the big questions that us as human beings tend to ask over the years, and even if we're religious, sometimes our faith can get shaken and so forth. And what's interesting to me is the comparison where Charles says, Mrs. Coulter is in this new world, right? And I thought they played that very well. And Charles is kind of explaining things to her. And I'm going to talk about that at more at length, but, Charles says they have no faith here, and they're consumerists, and the control is even greater, which is kind of fascinating because, from my perspective at least, it certainly seemed like the Magisterium itself was an evil entity, had a grip on Lyra's world, and so for Charles to make that comment does give pause because he's commenting on our own world, right? And so it kind of, is a nice commentary of like, well, what is really evil? Are we really controlled? And to what extent do we allow this sort of control in our own lives? So I thought that brought up an interesting thing. And, as far as the Magisterium, the real progress in today's episode was really about the doubling down of things. People are questioning the Magisterium, and so they're going to be even forthright. They're going to be kind of, hammering home the messaging and so forth, even more so. And as the new leader, newly appointed, he has a different viewpoint than some of his other members, and he also understands that there's something going on with Mrs. Coulter, hence why he has, his alethiometer reader, go and find out what Mrs. Coulter is up to. He knows something is up. And so what answer he gets will be interesting to see. But I love the connection in this episode because by putting the Magisterium there, it does put a duality to Mrs. Coulter, right? In seeing this new world, she sees motherhood in a different light, right? And not that necessarily she couldn't have motherhood in that sense in her old world with Lyra, but she had different ambitions, and that's as she kind of peels away the layers of the onion, if you will, she realizes that she could have actually prospered in this world, perhaps. When confronting Mary, Mary says to her, what have I read your work? What papers have you published? And then certainly later on, Mrs. Coulter says, I did publish works, but they had to put a man's name on it, and I could have been amazing and things like that. So I thought Ruth Wilson did an amazing job with the character and exemplifying the pain that was, so adequately put on the page, meaning the script. That this is a life that she of what could have been, and she's realizing certain regrets of X, Y, and Z, and it's just really powerful. How they did that. I really appreciated it. And, even the interaction with Mary, once again, Mary telling Mrs. Coulter that you must be proud of your daughter and so forth. It's both like a very motherly moment because, Mrs. Coulter, for all intents and purposes, does want to be proud of her daughter, and she does, I think, deep down want to be a good mother. She just has no clue how to do that, especially when she wants to protect her daughter, which in Lyra's mind is restrict her. And then certainly Lyra is exemplifying this nature that Mrs. Coulter never could have. Mrs. Coulter has done a lot of wonderful things in spite of the system, but the fact that Lyra has this continued free spirit and is unwavering in her beliefs and just is willing to do what she needs to do, and she's making things happen and affecting people in deep, meaningful ways, and this isn't the first time that someone has said to Mrs. Coulter that they admire Lyra, right? So it's not just that they're impressed with Lyra's mind, but they're also impressed with Lyra's kind-hearted nature, right? So the way in which Lyra is able to go about this is far different than Mrs. Coulter, right? There's different tactics, and one would imagine that Mrs. Coulter only imagined that this being kind of stoic and not showing an emotion was the only way to go about life, but the fact that Lyra is showing a different path, I think further pushes a dagger, pardon the pun, because this series is based off of The Subtle Knife, into Mrs. Coulter. But that's what I find so fascinating, and I made mention of it last review that I did, that Charles has this kind of fascination with Mrs. Coulter, and he certainly is proposing that in this episode. And of like, hey, we could live here together, we could both prosper, yada yada yada. But nonetheless, she sees the inherent flaws in Charles's thinking, or at least that's what I believe. When he calls Mary arrogant instead of like intellectual, as Mrs. Coulter views her, I appreciate the fact that Mrs. Coulter does confront him and say, "Do you view me as arrogant?" And he says, "No, right?" But you could tell she's not fully buying it, right? And I love that she confronts him like, while you've been kind of just parading around, these are all things that would have benefited our world and so forth. And you're essentially just building your own nest of money and other things. And, he makes the argument, well, I've created something, I've created an enterprise and so forth. But it kind of speaks to that consumerism that he so adequately identified at the top of the episode. So he's only giving into greed, or whatever you want to call it. So he is short-sighted in spite of understanding and being able to perhaps see the macro. And I find it fascinating that as short amount of time that Mrs. Coulter has spent here, she gets it more than him, perhaps. So now, as far as all the action stuff, I'm going to hold off talking about that until I get to Will and Lyra. Let me talk about Mary. Mary is supposed to play the serpent, and that's a very interesting thing. And I know I'm kind of starting towards the end, but it is interesting because the serpent, by all means, is supposed to represent evil. The fact that Charles has a snake as his demon does certainly not good, because he doesn't represent like a good character. And so Mary having to play the serpent herself, it's like, is that good? That doesn't sound on the surface that good, but she sees a divinity there in spite of her reservations, having grown up in the church and so forth. Hence why she opens up the Bible and kind of starts reading with it. And she's having to confront her two worlds, much in the same way when Mrs. Coulter does come in there. Mrs. Coulter identifies that she studied theology, and Mary says, how do the two combine science and theology in her own way, as she kind of poses it. Mrs. Coulter, of course, never really answers it in a deep, meaningful way, but certainly just the colliding of those two worlds, two things, two ideologies opens up Mary's mind. And she's given clear instructions of like, your work here is done. And, as audience members, right, we have the benefit of dramatic irony, knowing that there are multiple worlds and so forth. And so in that regard, we know just in that interaction what Mary's mission is going to be. But of course, for her, this is a holy WTF type of moment. But she handles it with grace. And, she is someone that, when compared to Will and Lyra have this courage that is unique, right? They represent courage in two different forms. And Mary has kind of always, at least up until now in my mind, represented a more timid nature, a reserved nature. And the fact that she accepts this mission without hesitation, really, and she's able to fool the guard and enter Cittàgazze. I love saying that word, although I also understand I can be completely saying it wrong. I do apologize for that. She goes there and, without reservation, as I mentioned. Now, of course, she does not know about the danger she is walking into, but in some sense, it's like in all our lives, in a sense, when we don't know the danger, that can be even scarier for us because we invent things, right? Our minds are very creative at coming up with fear-based things. Now, if she knew about the spectres, I don't know how she'd feel, but there's that side of it where she does get reassurance, and she doesn't necessarily know what this means, but again, we as an audience understand that when dust, I'll just call it dust, say to her, hey, you will have safe passage, we take that to understand that she will be protected from the specters. And that's assuring for us as audience members, and I think she'll kind of come to realize what that may fully mean, perhaps, or maybe she won't. It might just be blissful ignorance. Who knows? But as audience members, we do know that this isn't the first time we've seen the specters and what they do, and the fact that the boy who tried to steal the knife, the boy who Will had to fight to get the knife, we see the effects that it has on him. And not only that, we see the effect that it has on Will and Lyra, and now I'm transitioning to Will and Lyra. I think that's very powerful, because it continues to show the dangers of Will and Lyra's mission. There will be casualties. There already have been casualties, Roger being one of them. You know, we continue to see how beaten up Will is. There's the threat of Will's mother constantly, and in fact, you know, very real in today's episode through Charles. But in spite of that, you know, they continue to have to move forward in their own mission. And, you know, they do so. And the way they kind of, I appreciate the way Will does practice with the subtle knife and the way they devise this plan. But going back to real quick, the idea, the effect that this has on Will, you know, he does question, why am I the knife bearer, and so forth. And I think Lyra Lyra has been through this. You know, why did the alethiometer ultimately choose her? Why is she able to read it when most people in her world can't, right? And so it's that idea that it's both a blessing and a curse, and nonetheless he has to take up the mantle, much like she has been burdened with the alethiometer and must take up that mantle, and so forth. So I thought that was a very powerful moment between the two. And also, I just want to take a quick moment just to kind of go on a side tangent. It's always interesting, right? The knife. The alethiometer, at least in some sense, looks very special because it's got, you know, all these symbols on it and so forth. And the knife itself, you know, as the name implies, the subtle knife, you know, it's almost like the ark, not the ark, I'm sorry, in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail isn't much of a chalice. It's just this boring cup. And not to say that the subtle knife itself is boring or without cool design, but it does remind me of like Lord of the Rings, you know, these small ordinary objects, almost like every day, that have such powerful weight and can affect so many people's lives, you know, in the wrong hands. And, you know, I love the shape of it and things like that. And I love, you know, it certainly has some cool aspects to it, but at the end of the day, it's just a knife, right? And so it's very fascinating how that, you know, just that parallel. And I think, you know, that's kind of an aspect of it, much like in the way Mary was working with the cave, you know, things that were man-made gave some energy. And so, you know, looking back on it now, the recap of how this knife was made and so forth, I think speaks to this. You know, it came from a good place. There was a lot of craftsmanship that did have to go into it. Obviously, a lot of ingenuity. You know, it's not, I mean, there's only one knife that we know that exists like this. And so, you know, in that regard, it's not like I can grab any other knife and cut through worlds, right? You know, but yet it's still just a knife. And that's what's so fascinating to me. Anyway, going back to the story. So Will and Lyra figure out how to move about and cut open these worlds, or, you know, right now they're only cutting into Will's world. And, you know, they're devising the plan of how to get the alethiometer back, which is exciting because, you know, this culminated, it was a very subdued episode in the early half, but then it's culminating to all this very high tension towards the end, which I really appreciated. And, you know, I love how they set up, there's cameras, you know, there's the security cameras of Charles. And so, you know, even when Will and Lyra devise their plan, it's like, well, could the cameras catch them and so forth. And I love the aspect where Mrs. Coulter is in that kind of security room and watching Lyra. But ultimately she's in the basement where Will's about to get to. And then, you know, so it's like the juxtaposition of Charles interacting with Lyra and Will interacting with Mrs. Coulter, and how that culminates. And then obviously once it comes to a head, they switch off. And this was beautifully executed. it was just so brutal because you saw the effect this had on both on Will, on Lyra, and Mrs. Coulter. You know, coming face to face, Lyra, like just seeing the shock that Mrs. Coulter was there. And then Mrs. Coulter desperately trying to, you know, having the sense that no matter what she says, she wants to be very cautious because she doesn't want to frighten off Lyra. And then, you know, come the flip side of it, once things kind of really blow up, the rage. You know, we've seen this battle play out before between Pan and the monkey. And this time, you know, Pan just represents the full wrath of Lyra, and man, there is no mercy given to beating up the crap out of this monkey. And of course, this has a profound effect on Mrs. Coulter, and she understands, even in those moments, the pain in which she has forced Lyra towards, because, you know, it's not just, this isn't defense at this point. This is pure offense of just pounding away at the monkey. And certainly, you know, I didn't talk about it, but just as a kind of quick tangent, you know, the fact that the monkey is protective of Mrs. Coulter in spite of like almost having his heart shattered because Mrs. Coulter leaves him behind when she goes to see Mary. That I think has a profound effect, and yet the monkey remains loyal. You know, I mean, at the end of the day, it's a demon to Mrs. Coulter, but yeah, man, this was just brutal, and it was very painful, but at the same time fascinating to watch. And then, of course, Will is trying to kind of break her out of this almost mesmerized state because Lyra, you know, she's gone full force berserk. And so Will is like, hey, we have to get out of here. We have to get out of here. We have what, you know, essentially we have what we came for and we have to go. And of course, this is very courageous of Will because, you know, his mother is being threatened. You know, Charles plays his card of like, what would happen to your mother type of thing. And the fact that Charles knows Will's mother, like, you know, this is confirmation. This furthers the danger all of this represents. And so, you know, nonetheless, he makes the right decision and kind of goes. And, you know, in the nick of time, they get through. And what's fascinating to me, of course, is Mrs. Coulter, you know, says, like, you didn't tell me that they had a knife that cuts through worlds, you know. And Charles is very defeated, but Mrs. Coulter, you know, she's like, you know, you putz, right? And I do love this aspect of it because it does represent feminine strength, you know, where in this sense, the guy is very much defeated and doesn't want to continue. And sure, he knows the idea of the spectres. But as Mrs. Coulter says, you know, there's ways to understand things. And that's why I love the juxtaposition. I thought this was very well paced, very well executed. Because, you know, Mrs. Coulter says once you understand something, you can figure it out. Certainly, one can argue that's what Mary did. You know, she figured out dust. And now she's getting safe passage. Now, obviously, I think there's more to it than that. But nonetheless, you know, on the surface level, at least, that's what applies. And so Mrs. Coulter, if nothing else, she has a tremendous amount of drive. And then one of the last things that I want to touch upon before tying in the books is the idea that Lyra says, I thought it was a great scene between Will and Lyra where they're comparing, you know, family members and so forth. And Lyra says, I don't want to be compared to my mother, essentially. I don't want to be like my father. I don't want to have any of those traits. And Will essentially tells her it's okay, like, you can be your own person. And I think the reason why Lyra even says that is because tonight, was a representation of her mother's side, you know, that sort of wrath, vengeful type of person, just no mercy. Again, drawing the parallel to what, happened when she was in Mrs. Coulter's custody, like way back in season 1, and the monkey really strangling Pan in the way that the monkey did. And so, she wants to forget that side of her and never be that side. And I thought that was really well done. All right, so going into the books, right? So this is your spoiler warning. If you've made it this far, thank you. I appreciate you. Please, if you have any thoughts, comment down below. This isn't just about me talking and sharing my thoughts. I really want to have a discussion, with like-minded fans. And even if you disagree with the things that I've said, if you aren't fully loving the show, that's okay. Let me know why. Let's really discuss. You don't have to have the same opinion as me, but I have a thoughtful opinion, and let's converse. Let's have that meaningful dialogue. As far as the book, I thought I appreciate the fact that they're sticking overall to it, but I do like the addition. The last scene I just talked about between Will and Lyra. That's kind of a newer addition, or certainly expanded upon. So I appreciate that. The Magisterium, I was very critical of, I believe it was episode 2, how much they utilized the Magisterium. But now, in hindsight, I see that it was for, and I kind of, I copped to it then a little bit, but it serves a greater whole. And, now that they are able to utilize it in this way and show the dangers of it and use it sparingly where they don't have to be so heavy-handed, I do appreciate that. Even though that is newer from the book, that the book doesn't have this in there to this extent, certainly. From what I recall, and I could be wrong about this, so please A, forgive me and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't remember there being an interaction between Mary and Mrs. Coulter. I could be off, but my gut says that it didn't happen. Now, if it did, great. If it didn't, then kudos to the TV writers for putting this scene in there. I thought that was very well done. And, there's the way I'll call it the fight scene was executed in this episode varies from the way that it was handled in the book, but the spirit remains the same, and I thought this visually was very well done, character driven and all that. So, I have no qualms about it in that sense. And as far as where we're going, certainly we have 2 episodes left in this season. We have kind of, a lot of this, as I recall, Will and Lyra getting the alethiometer back kind of happened in the middle of The Subtle Knife. And The Subtle Knife is the quickest book of all 3 in terms of page length. And so in that sense, they kind of, in terms of the book, as I recall, they put a lot of, Lee Scoresby's adventures and so forth towards the latter half, and it became a little bit less about Will and Lyra and more about Mary, Lee, and perhaps the witches. And so I do appreciate that they are kind of keeping with the idea that this is going to be Will and Lyra's story, and they're sprinkling in these characters as needed. And certainly they've layered in Lee and the shaman, the witches, and so forth. And now they're kind of going to bring them back, and so forth. So we know things are headed in terms of the Magisterium, like we're kind of headed towards this epic battle on the mountainside. And how this plays out in the show will be fascinating. I am looking forward to that. Of course, I'm looking forward to Will meeting his father. That'll be interesting how they play that out, and to what extent Lyra is kind of utilized in that sense. And certainly we know where Mrs. Coulter is headed. She wants to get her daughter back. To what extent and what she's going to do with that, we'll see. I mean, obviously, if at this point you've read the books and so forth, so you kind of know where it's headed. But nonetheless, the execution of it in the show has been phenomenal, and so her taking Lyra back will be very interesting how this plays out. So I'm very much looking forward to that. And yeah, man, it's exciting. I really enjoy this. I thought there were going to be 8 episodes this season, but I also understand, as I even thought of it, as I just said it, the Subtle Knife being the shortest of the 3 books, it does make sense that perhaps you don't need all 8 episodes. You can tell in 7. And I'm excited where this culminates. And then, man, am I excited for the Amber Spyglass portion of his Dark Materials, which will, of course, be season 3. With the pandemic, who knows how it all pan out, but I look forward to that. Yeah, so much good stuff. This has been a welcome distraction for 2020, and continues to represent good stuff. And ultimately, I think this is my interpretation of this, as of right now at least, will be that it's less about religion, but more importantly about restrictions. We can look to things in society as restrictive versus people who want to create. And I think that's really kind of ultimately, because in my mind at least, religion doesn't have to be a bad thing. But when it's restrictive, it can be bad. Just like, Charles mentions, this world, at the top of the episode when he says, this world is even almost worse. I think that's a powerful statement and does make you reconsider stuff. So, a lot of good stuff, a lot of thoughts to ponder, a lot of good discussion. So, as I mentioned, please let's have this discussion. What are your thoughts about all this? Would love, the deeper meaning of all of it. Would love to chat with you. Anyway, thank you for joining me. I truly appreciate you. And I look forward to talking about the last 2 episodes of Season 2 in the coming weeks. Bye.